The atmosphere inside the aircraft carried the usual shuffle of voices and the steady drone of engines. But beneath the surface lingered a tension no one yet understood. A black teenager sat quietly with his boarding pass clutched in hand, unaware that the uniformed figure meant to protect order would instead turn authority into a weapon against him. What followed was not a single cruel act, but a chain of deliberate humiliations, each one designed to strip him further of his dignity, each one watched in silence by passengers who pretended not to see. Yet hidden within his small bag was a secret powerful enough to shift the balance of power midair, a secret that when revealed would force even the most arrogant to bow and expose how far prejudice can reach before justice rises. Stay with this story. Show support by liking and subscribing. And tell me in the comments what you think about how events like this unfold and where in the world you are watching from. The boarding line moved forward at a sluggish pace, the air thick with the sound of dragging suitcases, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter as families settled into their travel rhythm. 15-year-old Marcus Reed held his small backpack tightly against his chest, gripping the edges of his boarding pass, as though it were the most important document in his life. This was his first flight alone, a moment meant to mark his growing independence, a chance to prove to himself and his family that he was capable of managing a journey without anyone by his side. He had studied the numbers on his pass several times already, rehearsed in his mind how to find the right row, and promised himself that he would not get in anyone's way. His movements were careful, respectful, and quiet, the way a young man behaves when he wants to show the world that he is mature enough to follow the rules. Standing at the entrance to the aircraft was Meredith Sloan, a senior flight attendant with decades of experience and a reputation among her peers for efficiency. Her uniform was pristine, her posture impeccable, and her smile polished to the point of artificial perfection. To the casual eye, she embodied professionalism, but beneath the mask was something colder, something sharper. When Marcus reached her position and held out his boarding pass, she glanced at it briefly without even focusing on the seat assignment printed there. Instead of guiding him directly to a seat, she shifted her attention to the couple behind him, greeting them warmly and asking about their connecting flight. Marcus was left standing in the narrow entryway, blocking the flow of passengers as people shuffled restlessly behind him. The sensation of being in the way wrapped around him like a heavy coat, and his shoulders tensed as he pressed himself closer to the wall. The seconds stretched uncomfortably long as Meredith continued to exchange pleasantries with others, leaving him suspended in uncertainty, his presence treated as though it were invisible. At last, she flicked her wrist in a dismissive motion and gestured him toward a section of the cabin that did not match his ticket. The gesture was casual, careless, almost as if she were shooing a child from a kitchen table. Marcus, trusting the authority of her uniform, obeyed without hesitation. He walked down the aisle to the indicated row, found an empty seat, and slid into it quietly. He tucked his backpack under the chair and smoothed his shirt nervously, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. Yet an unease crept into his chest, whispering that something was wrong, that the boarding pass, still clutched in his palm, had not been given its due attention. From her vantage point near the front, Meredith allowed herself the briefest curl of satisfaction at the corner of her lips. She knew exactly what she had done. This was no accident, no moment of distraction caused by the chaos of boarding. It was deliberate, calculated, and cruel. She had redirected him to the wrong seat, setting a silent trap that would unravel later, when another passenger rightfully claimed it. To her, Marcus represented an easy mark, young, unaccompanied, and visibly different from most of the others. His quiet demeanor, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his hands gripped his belongings a little too tightly, all painted a portrait of vulnerability she felt she could exploit without consequence. She thrived on these small exercises of power, hidden beneath the polished surface of customer service, because they allowed her to remind herself who held control inside the cabin. As more passengers filed in, overhead bins began to slam shut, seatbelts clicked into place, and conversations about weekend plans and connecting flights filled the space. Marcus remained quiet, adjusting his seatbelt snugly, still holding the boarding pass with slightly trembling fingers. The excitement he had carried into the airport was dimmed, replaced by an unfamiliar anxiety. He replayed the boarding moment in his head, the way Meredith had not even read the pass, the way she had turned her back on him, the way she had gestured without care. He wondered whether he had done something wrong, whether he had stood incorrectly in line, whether he had asked too softly when it was his turn. Across the aisle, passengers settled comfortably, unaware of the subtle cruelty already in motion. Meredith moved with poise up and down the aisle, helping families with luggage, offering smiles to children, leaning in to reassure anxious travelers. To the untrained eye, she appeared flawless, an attendant who brought calm to the flight. Yet every time her gaze flicked toward the boy at the window, she felt the quiet thrill of superiority. He sat where he did not belong because she had willed it so. He sat under the weight of her authority, unseen by most but completely aware of his own smallness. The engines outside began to hum louder, a reminder that departure was near. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool window, watching the ground crew move like ants across the tarmac. His heart pounded with anticipation, not of adventure, but of uncertainty. Around him, passengers adjusted their belongings and prepared for the long journey, unaware of the silent humiliation already building. Meredith moved swiftly down the aisle, her uniform crisp, her expression composed, but her eyes sharp as they flicked toward Marcus. She slowed as she reached his row, pausing with the appearance of checking bins and straps, but her movements were anything but routine. She reached up deliberately to the overhead compartment above Marcus, tugging at his small carry-on bag. The boy opened his mouth as if to protest, but she had already yanked it free. With a calculated jerk of her wrist, she let the bag tumble down into the narrow aisle, where it landed with a thud that drew heads toward the noise. Marcus stiffened in his seat, his breath catching as the bag rolled slightly from the force. A businessman muttered impatiently as he stepped over it, his shoe nudging the fabric while others shifted around, treating it like an obstruction rather than a possession. Marcus's face flushed, but he stayed still, too intimidated to move, while Meredith stood over him with an air of annoyance. She did not pick up the bag or return it to the bin. Instead, she left it in the aisle, her hand resting casually on the compartment door as though she had merely completed a routine task. The passengers who noticed did not speak, but their glances carried subtle judgment, the kind reserved for someone assumed to be careless or out of place. Marcus's stomach tightened, the shame of it heavier than the bag, now lying abandoned among the scuffing shoes of strangers. Meredith raised her arm in an exaggerated motion, gesturing toward Marcus with a sweeping flourish as she glanced down the aisle. The gesture drew the eyes of several passengers, and she shifted her posture in a way that suggested she was managing a problem. To those watching, it looked as if the boy had somehow created a delay, that he had been the cause of disorder during boarding. Marcus shrank back against the seat, his small frame pressing into the hard plastic armrest, as though he could disappear. Every eye that landed on him felt like a spotlight, and the warmth of humiliation burned through his chest. The noise of shuffling bags and murmuring voices seemed amplified, pressing down on him from all sides. Meredith turned away with studied indifference, leaving the bag where it was. A mother with 2 children had to step awkwardly around it, pulling her kids close so they would not trip. Marcus finally reached down with trembling hands, pulling the bag toward him and tucking it beneath his legs. His cheeks burned as he fumbled, desperate to appear orderly, to erase the image Meredith had painted for the cabin. Yet the impression lingered, etched into the silent judgment of those who had witnessed the act. The flight attendants around Meredith remained oblivious, too focused on their own tasks, and the incident went unchecked, as though it had never happened. But for Marcus, the stain of it remained vivid. It was a cruel escalation from the first slight, a deliberate maneuver meant not only to inconvenience him, but to broadcast his presence as a disruption. He knew instinctively that she had singled him out, that this was not an accident or a moment of clumsiness. The way she had moved, the calculated drop, the theatrical gesture, all pointed to intention. The weight of injustice pressed against him, though he had no words to challenge it. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass of the window, watching the tarmac workers outside, trying to focus on the ordinary rhythm of their movements rather than the humiliation gnawing at him. The hum of voices around him carried on, passengers discussing their plans, exchanging light complaints about delays, adjusting their belongings as if nothing unusual had happened. To them, it was a fleeting inconvenience, quickly forgotten. His cheeks still carried the heat of shame, but he remained silent, determined not to cause further attention, determined to keep his head lowered. He wanted the plane to leave the ground quickly, to rise into the sky where perhaps things would settle, but the atmosphere around him offered no such relief. Meredith moved with a deliberate rhythm as she conducted her walkthrough, her hands gliding along the bins and seatbacks with manufactured grace. She slowed again when she reached Marcus's row, her gaze narrowing as she noted his quiet posture, his hunched shoulders, and the way he tried so hard to disappear into the background. Without speaking, she reached into her pocket and produced a bright yellow tag used for seat reassignment, something typically employed when passengers needed to be shifted due to logistical issues. She snapped it against the headrest above Marcus with a loud flick that drew the attention of nearby passengers. The tag hung boldly, its color impossible to ignore, glowing like a warning sign that marked him as different. Whispers rose among those seated nearby, eyes darting toward him with curiosity, confusion, and judgment. Marcus stared straight ahead, his pulse pounding in his ears, every muscle in his body tense. He had no idea why the tag had been placed above him, but he could feel what it meant. It separated him from everyone else, it branded him as a problem, and it invited the silent suspicion of strangers. Meredith adjusted the tag with exaggerated precision, stepping back to survey it as though she had performed a necessary correction. Then she turned and glided away, leaving Marcus beneath the bright mark that hovered above him like a cruel spotlight. The boy sank lower into his seat, his small frame pressed hard against the armrest, wishing desperately that he could pull the tag down and make it vanish. But his fear of defiance, his instinct to comply, held him motionless. The passengers around him avoided eye contact, but their avoidance only reinforced his sense of isolation. He felt like an exhibit on display, something to be stared at, silently judged, then dismissed. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet as the attendants prepared for beverage service. Marcus forced his gaze toward the window, trying to anchor himself to the distant sight of airport lights flickering against the fading sky. He told himself to endure, to wait for the moment when the engines lifted the plane and maybe the scrutiny would fade. But the respite never came. Meredith returned down the aisle, her tray balanced expertly, cups of water stacked neatly, her professional demeanor intact for all but one. When she reached Marcus, she leaned abruptly over him, her shadow falling across his tray. With a sudden snap of her wrist, she slammed the plastic cup down with unnecessary force. The water sloshed over the rim, spilling across his tray table and splattering onto his lap. The cold shock spread quickly through his pants, soaking the fabric, searing humiliation deeper into his skin. Marcus flinched instinctively, his hands shooting up to protect himself, but Meredith did not pause. She did not acknowledge the spill, did not hand him a napkin, did not even glance at the mess she had created. She pivoted smoothly, moving to the next row, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, as though nothing had happened at all. Marcus froze in disbelief, the chill of the water seeping through his clothes, the dampness clinging uncomfortably against his skin. He fumbled for the thin napkin tucked into the seat pocket, dabbing uselessly at the spreading stain. His throat tightened, and he fought against the urge to cry, aware that any visible weakness would only deepen the spectacle she had created. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some turning their heads away, others watching with averted eyes, unwilling to intervene, but unable to look entirely past what they had witnessed. Their silence cut sharper than words, sealing his isolation in an invisible cage. The bright yellow tag still hung above him, announcing his separation, while the wet mark on his lap deepened his disgrace. Marcus's chest ached with the weight of it all. He was a boy trying to prove he could handle the world alone, yet he was being dismantled piece by piece, stripped of dignity through carefully orchestrated acts of cruelty. He pressed the napkin against his clothes harder, but the paper disintegrated quickly, leaving him with damp hands and no relief. Meredith did not look back. She continued her service, smiling at others, offering calm words to nervous travelers, her cruelty tucked neatly beneath the mask of professionalism. To the unknowing eye, she was a model employee. To Marcus, she was a force determined to break him. He shifted again, pressing himself harder against the window. His body curled into the smallest shape it could manage. His heart raced as he tried to breathe evenly, to steady himself against the tide of humiliation crashing over him. He sat frozen, willing the seconds to pass quickly, hoping the moment would be forgotten. But Meredith's eyes found him again, sharp and cold, cutting through the illusion of safety he tried to build in his seat. She strode down the aisle with a clipboard in her hand, her movements crisp, her posture commanding, and her tone directed not at him, but at the cabin around him. She stopped beside his row, her gaze sweeping the passengers as though she were addressing the entire section, and with a swift motion of her hand, she beckoned another passenger forward. A man clutching his ticket hesitated, confused by the instruction, but Meredith gestured again with impatience, motioning directly at Marcus's seat. The man's eyes darted toward Marcus, then back to the attendant, uncertainty etched across his face. The silence grew heavier as passengers turned to watch, their attention now fully fixed on the boy, who had already endured enough humiliation. Meredith tapped her clipboard sharply, signaling the man to move closer, and then with a cold authority, she motioned toward Marcus. The meaning was unmistakable. He was to leave the seat. Marcus's stomach knotted as heat surged into his face. His chest tightened. His hands gripped the straps of his backpack, and for a moment he stayed rooted to the cushion, as though his body could anchor itself against her will. But the power dynamic was crushing. The uniformed authority of Meredith combined with the eyes of dozens of strangers, leaving him no choice. He rose slowly, his movements stiff, his throat dry, and pulled his bag into the aisle with shaking hands. The man slid into the seat without a word, grateful to escape the uncomfortable spotlight, leaving Marcus standing exposed while Meredith already turned her attention down the aisle, pretending it was all a matter of routine logistics. She did not offer him guidance with gentleness. Instead, she placed her hand firmly against his back, steering him like luggage being rolled to storage. Her grip was not violent, but it carried the unmistakable force of dismissal. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly as Marcus shuffled forward, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the carpet, his head bowed in shame. Whispers rose from behind him, hushed tones questioning what he had done, why he had been removed, murmurs that magnified his sense of guilt though he had done nothing wrong. Meredith's heels clicked with precise rhythm beside him, her stride brisk and unyielding, as she guided him toward the rear of the plane. When they reached the final row, she stopped abruptly and yanked open the small overhead bin above the seats near the lavatory. Without waiting for him to adjust, she seized his backpack and shoved it inside with such force that the fabric bulged against the compartment's frame. The sound echoed with a hollow thud, and she closed the bin with a snap, her movements sharp and dismissive, as though discarding something of no value. Marcus lowered himself into the cramped seat, his knees pressing against the hard wall in front of him, the smell of disinfectant and stale air drifting from the lavatory door only inches away. The seat was narrow, suffocating, and isolating, a far cry from the place he had been assigned, and the relocation carried a message that rang louder than words. He belonged at the back, away from the rest, stripped of dignity and shoved aside like refuse. Passengers who had turned to look at the scene gradually returned to their routines, yet the memory of their stares lingered in Marcus's chest like an ache. He could feel the weight of their assumptions, the silent conclusions drawn from Meredith's manipulations. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, the pressure of injustice pressing against him with no outlet, no chance for defense. Meredith smoothed her uniform, adjusted her clipboard, and walked away with calculated poise, her back straight, her head held high, her cruelty hidden beneath the thin veil of procedure. To anyone glancing casually, she had merely reassigned a seat for logistical purposes, but Marcus knew it had been deliberate, another step in the systematic stripping of his humanity. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft began its slow roll across the runway, but Marcus barely felt the vibration through the floor. He sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, the sting of humiliation searing into him as strongly as the cold water had earlier. Every detail etched itself into his mind. The sharp sound of the tag snapping above his head, the icy splash of water against his lap, the sharp clap of his backpack being shoved away, each moment stacked upon the last, building a structure of cruelty designed to confine him. His backpack, shoved roughly into the overhead bin by Meredith, might as well have been on another planet for how unreachable it felt, and his thin frame hunched smaller and smaller against the wall, as though he could compress himself into nothingness and escape the gaze of anyone who happened to notice him. The shame of being relocated still burned inside his chest, the silent judgment of the passengers who had seen him pushed aside like a piece of luggage, and although their stares had drifted away, their impression lingered, leaving him to carry the weight of assumptions he could never erase. The steady rhythm of the flight attendants moving carts down the aisles signaled the arrival of meal service, and the faint clatter of trays and utensils carried a strange comfort, a reminder of normalcy. But as the cart drew closer, Marcus's body stiffened, an unshakable instinct telling him that he was not about to receive the same treatment as the others. Meredith's presence loomed again, her steps measured, her smile warm as she leaned toward passengers in the rows ahead, setting down trays, asking if they needed extra water, offering small kindnesses that looked natural to all but him. She played her role with perfection until she reached the back, and then her hand, steady a moment before, bypassed his tray table without a pause, moving smoothly to the passenger beside him. Marcus sat still, his hands folded on the empty table before him, his eyes fixed on the gleaming surface as the faint smell of food filled the air. The woman next to him received her tray with a grateful nod, her fork already in hand before Marcus realized he had been skipped entirely. His chest tightened, his mouth dry, but he forced himself not to look up, not to beg, not to ask why. He knew already. The tray cart rolled past him as though he were not there, his hunger dismissed as easily as his seat had been, his dignity chipped away by omission. The sharp ache in his stomach was not only hunger, but the sting of exclusion, a deliberate denial of something so basic it underscored his lack of place among the others. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, the sound of clinking silverware and murmured conversation a cruel symphony that only heightened his sense of isolation. He swallowed hard, telling himself to endure, when suddenly another attendant, a younger woman with kind eyes, stopped near his row and glanced at his empty table. She reached instinctively for a tray, confusion flickering across her face at the sight of him without one. She bent to hand it to him, but before Marcus could even lift his hands to accept, Meredith appeared like a shadow, her arm extending with deliberate precision. Her fingers closed around the tray, and with a single sharp movement she pulled it back, sliding it into the cart before Marcus could touch it. The younger attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking from Marcus's empty table to Meredith's cold expression. But Meredith offered no explanation, no justification, only the silent authority of seniority that pressed the younger woman into silence. Marcus felt the rejection like a slap across his face, the denial sharper because it had come at the very moment hope had flickered. He pulled his hands back to his lap, his face burning, his throat tight, his stomach growling faintly beneath the roar of the engines. The younger attendant moved on reluctantly, her eyes filled with something Marcus recognized as pity, but pity offered no relief, only a mirror to his own degradation. Meredith straightened, smoothed the front of her uniform, and walked away without even a glance at him, her stride confident, her cruelty invisible to those who did not look closely. The passengers around him chewed their food, spoke quietly to one another, and avoided his eyes, their silence louder than any words. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, the edge of the tray table pressing into his stomach, its emptiness amplifying his humiliation. His mind spun with the cruel logic of what had happened. The yellow tag marking him as different, the water spilled deliberately across his lap, the forced relocation to the back, and now the denial of food. Each act built upon the last, a carefully constructed pattern that stripped away more than comfort. It stripped away his humanity. He was not being treated as a passenger anymore, not even as a child to be guided, but as something beneath both, something undeserving of the simplest recognition. The hunger gnawed at him, but the shame cut deeper, leaving him hollow in a way that food could not fix. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, the pressure building until tears stung his eyes. But he fought against them with every ounce of strength, unwilling to let the humiliation break the last shred of composure he had left. He turned his face toward the window, his reflection staring back faintly against the darkening sky, and he told himself that if he could hold on long enough, the torment might end. He hoped desperately that the torment might slow now, that perhaps the cruelest axe had already been dealt, but Meredith was not finished. Her presence returned like a shadow moving deliberately toward its target, her polished shoes clicking against the aisle floor, her uniform as sharp and immaculate as ever, the mask of professionalism still plastered across her face for all the world to see. She moved as though carrying out standard procedure, clipboard tucked beneath her arm, a faint smile ready for those who might glance her way. But her eyes, when they settled on Marcus, hardened into blades. She stopped at his row, leaned slightly, and reached for the buckle of his seatbelt. Marcus froze, his body stiffening as her hand closed around the strap. She gave it a sharp tug, and the belt snapped tight against his stomach with a sting that made him flinch, the sound of the sudden jerk loud enough to draw attention from passengers nearby. Heads turned, eyes flicked toward him, and the silence of their stares cut deeper than the physical snap of the belt. Meredith tilted her head, feigning scrutiny, as if what she had done was nothing more than a necessary compliance check, but the smirk tugging faintly at her lips told the truth. The gesture had not been about safety. It had been about spectacle. Marcus's hands gripped the edges of his seat as his face flushed, the sharp pain in his abdomen already fading, but the burn of humiliation spreading faster than any physical ache. He wanted to disappear, to sink beneath the seat and vanish from sight, but the attention was fixed firmly on him, an unwanted spotlight he could not escape. Meredith straightened with calculated calm, smoothed the front of her uniform, and stepped back slightly as two other crew members approached to continue their routine walkthrough. She paused deliberately, waiting until they were close enough to hear and see, then extended her arm in a subtle but unmistakable gesture toward Marcus. She shook her head slowly, her expression exaggerated, her lips pressed together in feigned disapproval, as though silently warning them of a troublesome passenger. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible to anyone not looking directly at her, but it was enough to plant the seed. The other attendants glanced briefly at Marcus, their expressions neutral, but their eyes lingering just long enough for him to feel their judgment. They moved on without comment, but the damage was done. The shake of Meredith's head had branded him once more, another mark layered atop the humiliation already inflicted. Marcus sat frozen, his chest heaving with shallow breaths, as though the air itself were heavier in this part of the cabin. He could feel the weight of whispers from passengers nearby, the subtle shifts of bodies leaning ever so slightly away from him, the ripple of isolation growing stronger with each deliberate act. His body curled smaller in the seat, his hands gripping tightly at his sides, his head turned toward the window as though the darkness outside could shield him from the cruelty inside. He wanted to scream that he had done nothing wrong, that he had followed every rule, that he was only here to travel like everyone else, but his voice stayed trapped in his throat, smothered by the fear that speaking up would only invite more. Meredith lingered just long enough to ensure the gesture had taken hold before gliding forward again, her step smooth, her back straight, her authority unchallenged. To the casual observer, she was simply doing her job, ensuring safety, communicating silently with her team. To Marcus, she had turned him into an object of ridicule, a symbol of disorder displayed for her colleagues, a target framed by subtle signals only those with power could wield. It was not the loud humiliation of words or accusations, but the quiet destruction of reputation, executed through gestures so small they might be invisible to those unwilling to look deeper. Yet to him, they were crushing, each one pressing him further into invisibility while simultaneously making him stand out as a problem. The boy's chest ached with the effort of holding back tears, His throat burned from swallowing them down, and his stomach twisted with hunger and shame. He stared at his faint reflection in the window, the darkness outside broken by the faint glow of city lights far below, and wondered how something as simple as a journey home had transformed into a nightmare of isolation and cruelty. Each act stacked upon the last: the ignored boarding pass, the wrong seat assignment, the drop bag, the yellow tag, the spilled water, the forced relocation, the denial of food, and now the violent snap of the seatbelt and the silent branding to the other crew. The pattern was undeniable, each strike more cutting than the last, each humiliation more deliberate, and he knew with certainty that this was not over. Yet behind that mask was the same cold satisfaction she had carried all flight, the knowledge that she had successfully diminished him in the eyes of others, turned him into a spectacle, stripped him of dignity piece by piece. But as the plane jolted sharply again, fate delivered what neither she nor Marcus could have foreseen. The overhead bin above Marcus's seat shuddered violently, and the latch, improperly secured when Meredith had shoved his bag into it with careless force earlier, popped open. His backpack tumbled out, crashing onto the floor with a thud that echoed above the drone of the engines. The zipper, stressed from her rough handling, split partially open on impact, spilling its contents across the aisle in a scatter of papers and a small hard case. The sound and sight drew immediate attention, passengers turning their heads, eyes widening as sheets skidded across the floor, some fluttering against shoes, others landing beneath seats. Marcus's heart sank as he bent to gather them, his hands shaking, his face flushed with fresh humiliation at the thought of more eyes on him. But then the nature of what had fallen began to register not only with him, but with those who reached instinctively to help. One sheet bore the unmistakable embossed seal of the federal judiciary, the bold stamp shining faintly under the cabin lights. Another paper displayed the letterhead of a federal court, names and case references visible to any who glanced. The small hard case, when nudged open by a passenger's foot, revealed a polished metal nameplate engraved with the title Judge Alphonse Reed. A murmur rippled through the cabin as hands passed the items back toward Marcus, eyes widening in surprise, confusion, and dawning recognition. The boy accepted the papers with trembling fingers, tucking them hurriedly against his chest, but the evidence could not be erased now. Whispers swelled into the kind of low roar that spreads quickly in confined spaces, passengers exchanging incredulous glances, piecing together the connection that until this moment had been invisible. This was not just a boy traveling alone, not just a child easy to dismiss. He was connected to a federal judge, someone whose authority stretched far beyond the cabin walls, someone whose position carried weight and consequence that could not be ignored. Meredith froze mid-step, her posture stiffening as she turned to see the scene unfolding. Her eyes narrowed, first at the scattered documents, then at the murmuring passengers, and finally at Marcus himself, who clutched the items to his chest like a shield. For the first time that flight, her confidence faltered, the mask of composure slipping as the realization settled in. The boy she had targeted so ruthlessly was not powerless. The evidence of his identity, once hidden quietly in his bag, now lay exposed for all to see. Marcus sat upright now, his chest still heaving with the weight of humiliation, but his arms folded protectively around the documents that bore his father's name and title. He had not chosen for them to be revealed, had not wanted this moment to come in such a chaotic fashion, yet the truth had forced its way into the open through no effort of his own. The turbulence subsided gradually, the plane settling back into smoother air, but the cabin remained tense, alive with murmurs and sidelong glances. Passengers who had witnessed his humiliation earlier now exchanged quiet whispers, their eyes shifting from Meredith to Marcus and back again. The story they had been silently told by Meredith's gestures and actions was unraveling, replaced by a new narrative written in official seals and engraved nameplates. Meredith bent quickly, feigning an attempt to help collect the last of the papers, but her hand lingered too long on one sheet, her eyes scanning the seal as if to confirm the authority stamped there. She handed it back stiffly, her voice caught in her throat, unable to produce the smooth platitudes she had offered so easily before. The younger attendant, the one who had earlier tried to hand Marcus a meal, stood frozen nearby, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and recognition. She had seen cruelty all along, but now she saw consequence looming behind it, and her gaze lingered on Meredith with something close to accusation. Marcus tucked the last paper into the partially open bag, his hands still trembling, but his spine a fraction straighter than before. He felt the shift in the air around him, the subtle but undeniable change in how the cabin regarded him. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Elias Drummond stepped out, tall and commanding, his presence immediately commanding respect. His face carried the calm steadiness of a man accustomed to responsibility, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the cabin with a quick assessment that revealed he already knew something unusual had happened. Passengers quieted instinctively, their whispers dropping to hushed tones as they watched him stride down the aisle. He did not stop at Meredith, who stiffened as he approached, but continued until he reached the rear of the aircraft where Marcus sat. The boy's heart pounded as the captain bent to collect the last stray paper that had fluttered beneath the seat, the embossed seal catching the cabin light as he lifted it. He studied it for a moment, then looked at Marcus, his gaze steady but not unkind, before sliding the document back into the boy's backpack. Straightening, Captain Drummond produced the passenger manifest he had carried from the cockpit, flipping it open to the correct section. He scanned the names quickly, his finger tracing the list until he stopped, then read the row and seat assignment aloud for his own confirmation. Marcus Reed, assigned to a premium class seat in the forward section of the cabin. A ripple moved through the passengers as the truth landed, confirmation that the boy who had been shunted to the back by Meredith had every right to sit where he had been placed originally. Marcus's throat tightened, his hands clutching the straps of his backpack, a mix of relief and humiliation washing through him. The captain closed the manifest with a snap that cut through the silence, his jaw tight, his eyes turning to Meredith. Her composure faltered further under his gaze, her practiced smile trembling at the edges. She opened her mouth as if to explain, but he raised a hand, silencing her before words could form. With measured calm, he gestured toward one of the younger attendants and requested access to the cabin surveillance system, the discrete cameras mounted throughout the aircraft that silently observed boarding and in-flight activity. The attendant hesitated, casting a glance toward Meredith, but the captain's authority left no room for debate. Within minutes, the small screen in his hand flickered to life, displaying a grainy but clear recording of the boarding process. Passengers craned their necks subtly, eager but cautious, as the captain rewound the footage to the moment Marcus had entered the aircraft. They saw Meredith glance at his boarding pass without reading it, saw her ignore him as she turned to others, saw her dismissive gesture sending him to the wrong seat. The footage continued, showing her removing his bag from the overhead bin and letting it fall into the aisle, her exaggerated gesture toward him marking him as a disruption. The bright yellow tag snapped onto the headrest above him. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as the truth became undeniable. The carefully polished facade of professionalism Meredith had worn all flight unraveling in the face of irrefutable evidence. Marcus sat frozen, his chest heaving as he realized others could finally see what he had endured, the pattern of cruelty no longer hidden behind subtle gestures and authority. For the first time since boarding, he did not feel entirely invisible, though the weight of exposure left him trembling. The captain played the footage again, this time stopping at the image of the spilled water, Meredith's sharp movement captured in stark clarity as the cup struck the tray table and splashed across Marcus's lap. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath, the disgust in their tones unmistakable. The younger attendant who had tried to give Marcus a meal earlier stood rigid, her eyes fixed on Meredith. Her earlier pity now hardened into quiet outrage. Meredith's face drained of color as the captain lowered the device, his expression stern. He did not raise his voice, did not resort to theatrics, but the authority in his presence spoke louder than any words. He instructed her to stand beside him, his voice carrying through the cabin, informing the passengers that the airline held zero tolerance for mistreatment or discrimination. The murmurs grew louder, passengers nodding, some openly glaring at Meredith as she stood stiffly, her shoulders rigid, her mask of composure shattered completely now. Marcus felt the faint stirrings of vindication, though it was tangled with exhaustion and the remnants of humiliation. He had been stripped of dignity piece by piece, but now the fragments of truth were stitching together into a tapestry that revealed the cruelty he had suffered for what it was. The captain placed a steady hand on the back of his seat, not in pity, but in reassurance, a gesture that carried with it the promise of protection and acknowledgement. For the first time on the flight, Marcus felt the crushing weight on his chest ease slightly, the heavy silence around him shifting into something closer to solidarity. The revelation of the surveillance footage spread quickly, the whispers turning into open commentary, passengers voicing disapproval of Meredith's actions. A man in a business suit shook his head in disbelief, muttering about professionalism, while the woman seated beside Marcus offered him a small, sympathetic nod. The atmosphere, once complicit in silence, now turned against the very person who had wielded authority as a weapon. Meredith remained frozen, her polished image shattered, her authority stripped away in front of those she had tried to impress with her cruelty. The captain's words were measured but sharp as he announced to the cabin that justice, even within the confined space of an aircraft, must be upheld, and that those entrusted with authority must wield it with fairness, not malice. His gaze swept the rows of passengers before returning to Meredith, and his words, steady and firm, cut through the silence with the finality of judgment. He ordered her to step forward, not to retreat behind the mask of professionalism she had worn all flight, but to face the very cabin she had manipulated into watching a boy suffer humiliation after humiliation. Her steps were reluctant, stiff, and every inch of her movement betrayed the arrogance that once fueled her now crumbling into fragments. The passengers watched, their eyes unblinking, their disapproval heavy, their judgment evident in every furrowed brow and every shake of the head. She stopped midway down the aisle, her face pale, her polished appearance unraveling under the scrutiny of those she had once manipulated with smiles and subtle gestures. Captain Drummond's command was clear. She was to restore Marcus to his rightful seat in the premium section, the very place he had been assigned from the start before her lies and cruelty stripped him of dignity. The order was not only for her to correct what she had broken, but to do so visibly, publicly, with the acknowledgement of every passenger who had witnessed the injustice unfold. Meredith's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. Her voice caught somewhere between defiance and surrender, but she obeyed, her body moving as if dragged by invisible chains of consequence. She stepped to Marcus's row, her movements jerky, her hands trembling as she reached for his backpack in the overhead bin she had once slammed shut with disdain. The sound of the latch opening this time was hollow, devoid of the cruelty that had marked it earlier. She lowered the bag carefully, her hands shaking, before turning to Marcus, who sat frozen, his heart racing with the disbelief that this reversal was happening at all. The captain gestured firmly, and Meredith extended the backpack to Marcus, her fingers brushing against his as she placed it in his lap. The boy's hands closed around it with a quiet strength, the weight of it no longer a burden, but a symbol of the dignity being returned to him piece by piece. Captain Drummond then instructed her to escort him forward, not as a child shuffled away in silence, but as a passenger restored to the place he had always deserved. Marcus rose slowly, his legs unsteady from the hours of humiliation, but he straightened his back as he stepped into the aisle, his chin lifting slightly, the spark of resilience visible even through the exhaustion etched across his face. Meredith walked beside him, her once confident stride reduced to a stiff shuffle, her face flushed as the passenger's eyes bore into her, judgment following her with every step. Each row they passed seemed to press the humiliation deeper into her skin, the quiet disapproval of strangers louder than any scolding words. When they reached the premium section, Meredith gestured reluctantly to Marcus's rightful seat, the leather cushion waiting, as though it had been empty in defiance of her earlier lies. Marcus slid into it, his chest heaving with the mix of relief and disbelief, the comfort of the seat a stark contrast to the cold, cramped space by the lavatory where he had been confined. Captain Drummond's voice carried again, sharp and resolute, declaring to the cabin that the airline stood against mistreatment, that discrimination had no place within the walls of their aircraft, and that passengers entrusted to their care would not be reduced by the arrogance of any crew member. Applause rippled through the cabin, hesitant at first, then swelling with conviction as more passengers joined, their clapping hands echoing through the air, their voices rising in murmured agreement. Meredith's face burned crimson as she stood frozen beside Marcus, her authority stripped, her reputation unraveling with every clap of disapproval that filled her ears. The captain did not let the moment end there. He instructed her to complete one final act, an order that carved away the last of her arrogance. She was to serve Marcus the meal she had denied him, to place it before him with her own hands, and to do so while the cabin watched in silence. The humiliation was deliberate, but it was also justice, the balance of power restored in the only way it could be within the confines of the plane. Meredith's hands trembled as she collected the tray, the aroma of food rising from it, the very sustenance she had once withheld as a weapon. She stepped forward, her movement slow, and set it gently onto Marcus's tray table. The contrast between the earlier violent slam of the water cup and the careful placement of the meal now undeniable. Marcus's eyes flicked upward briefly, his gaze steady as it met hers for the first time without flinching. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not revel in her downfall, but his calm acknowledgement was more cutting than any words could have been. He accepted the meal, his hand steady, his dignity slowly piecing itself back together with each passing second. The passengers remained silent, their eyes locked on the scene, the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on Meredith until she could hardly stand beneath it. Captain Drummond's gaze remained fixed on her, ensuring that the act was completed, ensuring that the balance had shifted fully back to where it belonged. Meredith stepped back, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, the polished mask of professionalism shattered entirely now. She stood exposed before the cabin, not as an authority figure, but as the embodiment of arrogance, laid bare and broken. Marcus lifted his fork slowly, his hand still trembling, but the simple act of taking his first bite of the meal carried with it a resonance that spread through the cabin. It was not only food he consumed, but the restoration of humanity, the return of dignity stripped from him so cruelly hours before. The applause swelled again, passengers clapping with renewed force, their voices rising in support, their approval directed not only at the captain's command, but at the boy who had endured so much and remained standing. The descent began with a familiar chime and the captain's voice over the intercom, steady and calm, announcing to the passengers that the flight would soon be arriving at its destination. But beneath the routine, words there lingered a heavier awareness, an undercurrent shaped by the events that had unfolded thousands of feet above the earth. Marcus sat quietly in his rightful seat at the front, his meal tray cleared now, his body still tired, but his dignity partially restored, the memory of humiliation still raw, but tempered by the shift of power that had placed him back where he belonged. The murmurs of passengers drifted through the cabin, some still whispering about the documents, others commenting openly on what had been revealed by the surveillance footage, their voices carrying tones of anger and disbelief directed at Meredith. The woman herself remained near the galley, silent, her polished mask long since shattered, her eyes cast downward, her authority stripped from her in front of the very people she had sought to impress with cruelty. She stood alone, her posture stiff, but the weight of judgment heavier than any turbulence. As the plane tilted toward the runway, the hum of the engines changing pitch, the passengers tightened their seatbelts, prepared for landing, but their eyes still flicked occasionally toward Marcus, the boy who had endured so much in silence until truth forced itself into the light. He did not return their glances, his gaze fixed on the window where lights twinkled against the darkness below, his reflection faint against the glass, the image of a boy who had been tested far beyond what any child should endure, yet carried himself with quiet resilience. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the cabin rattling briefly, and then the roar of engines slowed as the aircraft decelerated, the runway lights flashing in steady rhythm outside. Relief rippled through the passengers, but for Meredith the landing was not salvation. It was the arrival of consequence. When the plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off, the usual rush to stand and gather belongings began, but before passengers could fully rise, uniformed airline supervisors and security officers stepped aboard, their presence unmistakable, their posture sharp, their purpose clear. The murmurs died instantly, the cabin falling into an uneasy silence once more as the officers moved forward, their eyes trained not on Marcus, but on Meredith. She stiffened visibly, her hands gripping the edge of the galley counter, her face pale, her body trembling beneath the weight of inevitability. The captain emerged from the cockpit and exchanged a brief nod with the officers, then turned toward the passengers, his voice steady as he assured them that disembarkation would proceed shortly, but that immediate matters of accountability had to be addressed first. The officers approached Meredith, their presence towering, and gestured firmly for her to step forward. She hesitated, her lips parting as though to defend herself, but the evidence had already been laid bare, the lies exposed, the footage undeniable, and her protests dissolved before they could form. Slowly, with reluctant steps, she moved into the aisle, the clipboard still clutched against her chest like a fragile shield. The passengers, still seated, turned their heads as one, their gazes heavy, their silence a louder condemnation than any shouted words. As she walked past, whispers surged again, sharp and cutting, fragments of disbelief and anger piercing the quiet. The officers flanked her, guiding her toward the exit, their presence ensuring she could not slip back into the false authority she had once wielded so easily. By the time she reached the door, her mask was gone entirely, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed, her disgrace complete. Marcus watched quietly, his chest rising and falling steadily. The sight of her escorted away, carrying with it not triumph, but something more sobering, the reminder that cruelty, no matter how carefully disguised, cannot withstand the truth when it is brought into the light. The captain turned to him then, his gaze steady, his expression softening with the kind of respect that spoke louder than any applause. He stepped closer, placed a hand gently on the headrest near Marcus's seat, and gave a single nod, a gesture that conveyed acknowledgement, apology, and solidarity all at once. It was not a grand statement, not a theatrical display, but it carried the weight of sincerity, the kind of respect that could not be faked. Marcus met his gaze briefly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came, only the quiet exchange of understanding between a boy who had endured cruelty and a man who had seen justice restored midair. The passengers began to gather their belongings again, but this time their movements slowed as Marcus rose from his seat, his backpack slung carefully over his shoulder. Without a word, they parted to let him pass, the aisle clearing as if by instinct, the crowd acknowledging his journey not with clapping now, but with a silence filled with respect. He moved steadily forward, his steps small but deliberate, each one carrying him away from humiliation and toward something larger than himself. The passengers watched him go, their eyes filled not with pity, but with admiration, a recognition of resilience forged in the fire of injustice. As he stepped through the cabin door, the cool air of the jet bridge brushing against his face, Marcus carried with him not only the remnants of pain, but the quiet knowledge that he had survived what was meant to break him. Behind him, the disgraced attendant disappeared into the custody of her consequences, her arrogance dismantled, her authority stripped. Ahead of him stretched the path back to family, to familiarity, to safety, but also the memory of a night when the sky itself bore witness to cruelty and to justice. The message of it lingered not only for him, but for every soul who had watched, a reminder that silence in the face of injustice makes cruelty stronger, but truth, once revealed, reshapes the balance of power and restores dignity to those who had been stripped of it. The end. If this story kept you engaged until the very end, I would truly appreciate it if you could show support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next story we bring to life. Tell me in the comments what you think about the way justice unfolded in this flight. Was the punishment enough for what Meredith did? Or do you believe more should have happened after landing? I would also love to know where you are watching from today, whether it's late at night in your living room, on a morning commute, or somewhere else entirely. Your perspective adds to the conversation, and your comments help guide what stories we share next.